Hello.
Hello, please.
Yeah, what's the problem, sir?
We just drove down our farm track.
Yeah.
Go and feed our pheasants. We come across a Range Rover with 3 people in it.
Yeah.
It appears that they're dead. I don't know what's happening. Blood in the motor all over them.
And welcome back to a new video on the Essex Boys case. As always, if you are enjoying the content, please do give the video a thumbs up. And if you're interested in the Essex Boys case or simply true crime in general, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. And in this video, we're going to hear from an eyewitness report which claims to have seen a Ford Escort van driving erratically away from the crime scene shortly before 7:50 p.m. on the evening of December the 6th. 1995. We're also going to take a closer look into Darren Nichols' supposed version of events for that very same evening. Firstly, let's start with this eyewitness account, and then I'm going to share with you a photograph which you may find interesting towards the end of this video. The following statement is from Kevin Tarbuck, dated the 14th of the 12th, 1995. I work for Sutcliffe Industrial Services Limited, who at present have a contract at Hanningfield Water Treatment Works. When I finish work, I leave the site and turn right onto the A130 towards Southend. I've been working on that site for around 5 weeks and have travelled along that road every evening during that period. At around 19:40 hours on Wednesday the 6th of the 12th, 95, I finished work and started my journey home. As I approached Rettendon along the A130, I had just passed White House Farm on the left-hand side and was approaching a small lane again on the left-hand side. As I got nearer to the lane, a white Ford Escort van emerged from the lane and turned left towards Rettendon in front of me. I only saw it had one male person in the vehicle who was driving. The reason I remember this is that in pulling out in front of me, it had caused me to brake, and because it was icy and snowing, I thought what an idiot he was. The vehicle then accelerated away from me. I followed, but by the time I'd reached the Rettendon Turnpike, the van was nowhere to be seen. I would think that the van was a D or E registration due to the style of the vehicle. I would not be able to identify the driver again. I would estimate the time that this happened would be around 19:50 hours. At the time of the incident, it was dark and snowing. I had my windscreen wipers on and my headlights. In spite of these conditions, visibility was fairly good. There was no other vehicle immediately in front of me nor behind me. If the van had waited for me to pass, he could have pulled out without affecting anybody. The vehicle was in my sight for around 15 seconds and the nearest I was to it was around 30 yards. Okay, now this is one of the more odd eyewitness accounts. This isn't a white vehicle as in a Ford Sierra, a Cosworth or any sort of white type sports car being seen with the Range Rover on the day or the evening of their deaths. This is a white transit van, quite an old one, around the 85 or 86 year registration. And what's interesting about this actual statement is the fact that this guy probably isn't from the actual area of Rettendon or maybe even Essex, but he's been travelling on that exact road every single day for the past 5 weeks. So you have to believe that he's become incredibly familiar with that road. He knows with White House Farm on the left hand side and also the little tucked away farm track just on the left hand side past White House Farm. Now, why this actual eyewitness account is interesting in itself is the fact that this vehicle is driving in what you would class as a bit of a careless or erratic or possibly even nervous manner. Now, this occurs at around 7:50 p.m. on the evening of their deaths. Now, the official narrative is that Tucker, Tate and Rolfe were killed between 6:48 and 6:58 p.m. on December the 6th, 1995. But what's actually drawn my attention to this statement in particular is the fact that in some ways it does actually mirror Darren Nichols' version of events for being the getaway driver when he pulls out of Workhouse Lane back onto the main road. An incident occurs in both of these instances. This statement from this man who was travelling from Hanningfield Water Treatment Works, and also Darren Nichols' version of events and his statement under oath, and also his book Blogs 19, where he describes a similar event occurring. So firstly, let's take a look at Darren Nichols' statement under oath. Mick had shut the door of the car and said, "Let's get going." He said to go left towards the Rettendon turnpike, so I pulled out. Something clicked in my mind that something had happened. I pulled out in front of a car. Mick asked if I was okay. I said yes I was, and we drove up the road towards the Rettendon turnpike. Now let's take a look at a passage from the book Blogs 19 by Tony Thompson, where Darren Nichols is recalling the same event. Mick told me to get going, and though my mind was elsewhere, my body somehow obeyed, putting the car into gear and moving off towards the main road. From then on, everything happened in slow motion. I saw the headlights, heard the screech of tyres, and braced myself for impact. But it never came. Mick had grabbed the steering wheel at the last moment and wrenched it to one side, avoiding a crash by just a few inches. The other driver flashed his lights and swore at me out of his half-open window. I just pulled out onto a main road without looking, but I honestly didn't know where I was or what I was doing. I just sat there like a zombie. Okay, now I know a few of you watching this video are immediately going to jump to the conclusion that it may have been Darren Nichols driving this Ford Escort van, and he pulled out in front of this unsuspecting motorist. But that isn't actually the case, because Darren Nichols' mobile phone was picked up on either the Marks Tate or the Basildon transmitter during the time that this eyewitness account actually happened. So we can pretty much discredit the fact that this was Darren Nichols driving the Escort van and pulling out in front of this motorist. But so why is this even important? Why is this eyewitness account even relevant to the story of the murders of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe? The reason I find it important and actually relevant is the fact that it's almost as if Darren Nichols is recalling events told to him. When you look at Darren Nichols' statement in its entirety, certain aspects of his statement have a lot of detail. You know, for instance, when they were at the pub with Jack and Mick and they're about to pull off to head towards Rettendon, Darren Nichols adds in little details such as, we got out to change the number plates, I got my feet wet, I got back in the vehicle, we had to put the heater on because the windows were misting up because it was so cold outside. He adds little elements of detail to add further credibility to what he is exactly saying. But then there's other elements of his story which are completely lacking in detail, which you would have thought would have been remembered if you were actually there during that time period, such as the calls between Michael Steele and Jack Womes after 6 p.m. These two phone calls, which definitely occurred, I believe one was around 20 seconds and one was just under a minute long, go completely unmentioned by Darren Nichols, despite the fact that he tells us that he was in the company of Jack Womes during this time period. Just to make it a little bit simpler, a lot of his statement actually has a lot of detail, but it's completely irrelevant detail, which adds credibility to the story he is actually telling. Whereas other events which could have proven with a great deal of certainty that he was actually there during this time period, such as the phone calls and recalling that these phone calls actually took place between Steele and Womes, go completely unmentioned. To get a real understanding of exactly what I am saying here, let's quickly revisit Darren Nichols' version of events for December the 6th, and let's pick out some areas in which he is quite vague and others in which I believe he adds additional detail in order to add credibility to his version of events. I went through Rettendon the latter part of 1995. I remember an occasion when I was there with other people. They were Jack Womes and Michael Steele. I remember that day. I was working. I was working at Sunbury-on-Thames. My mobile phone was with me. Michael Steele rang me that day and he wondered where I was and said he'd like to meet me. We did not discuss where we'd meet because I was at work. I agreed to meet him later on that day at Ron Parkinson's Motorcycles at Marks Tate at 5 p.m. I drove to Marks Tate in I think my Golf convertible. I've been to Ron Parkinson's before. It sells motorcycles. When I arrived, I parked in the flats opposite. Mr. Steele wasn't there when I arrived. When I arrived, I went into the motorbike shop and I bought something for my old motorbike. It was either a battery or a light bulb. I then put it in my car. Right, so let's just cut in here very quickly. First of all, he can't remember, but he believes it was the Golf convertible that he was driving to go and meet them. Now, my first thought when reading that is that if I'd been involved basically involved in a triple murder, as in I was an unwitting getaway driver, the first thing I'm going to remember is exactly what I was driving that evening. So he's a little bit vague here with, I think I was driving my Golf convertible. And then it starts to get even more vague when he can't remember if it was a battery or a light bulb that he purchased from the motorbike shop. Now, why would he be so vague? Let's just play devil's advocate here for a moment. Is this because he didn't have a receipt to prove that he was actually there, that he actually purchased anything? So in order to muddy the waters, he said either a battery or a light bulb, really so that it couldn't be traced back to him, so that he couldn't really, be proven to be telling a lie. I mean, if he said, for instance, I went there and I purchased a battery, they went there and they looked at the till receipts and there was no one purchasing a battery around that time, it's going to look a little bit strange. Whereas a light bulb is a commonly bought item, probably more so, or a lot more so than a battery would have been. And they probably sell, obviously, a lot more light bulbs than they do batteries. So is that why he chucked in the light bulb, for instance, so that they could possibly check the till rolls, check that he was actually there during that time period? These two instances of vagueness are quite interesting because, I mean, I can only speak for myself personally, but I certainly would have remembered the actual car that I was driving when I became a getaway driver for a triple murder. Now, what I would like to know is, did the police and the investigators of this case actually go to the occupiers of the flats where Darren Nichols said he parked the vehicle? Did they actually go and speak to these people to see if a Golf convertible was parked there during that time, on that day? I don't have any record at all of anyone claiming to see a Golf convertible parked outside these flats. That's not to say that it didn't happen, but did the police take these steps necessary to actually back up and prove Darren Nichols' version of events? Did Darren Nichols say, well, I believe I was driving a Golf convertible that day? Is he kind of hedging his bets here just in case they do actually take those steps to check with the occupiers and it comes back that the vehicle was never seen? You need to remember this was around 5:30 in the evening. People were finishing work. There may well have been witnesses that could have backed up Darren Nichols' version of events, saying that there was, in fact, a convertible parked there during that time period. But we don't have any record or any eyewitness accounts to back up what Darren Nichols is claiming. Whilst I was walking back to my car, I saw Mick. I waved to him and said I was just putting something in my car. And then I got in his pickup truck. The pickup truck was a red Toyota. It was an M registration, I think. When I got in, I sat in the passenger seat. He said they were going down to do a deal with Pat, him and Jack. I said, where is Jack? He said he'll be here in a minute. I don't recall anything else he said. Then I noticed Jack had pulled up behind us. Jack was in a beige Volkswagen. It was a B registration. I had sold the car to Michael Steele. When he pulled up, he got out and spoke to Mick. I don't recall what was said. Then he got back in his car. Then we pulled off onto the A12 heading towards London. I was with Mick in his Toyota and Jack behind us in his Volkswagen. I can't recall exactly what was said, but he said we would meet Pat and there was going to be a drug deal, or we were having a drug deal, I can't remember. So what we get in this section of the statement is some more vagueness. Now, you can't really put too much emphasis on this, as you may well not have recalled exactly what was said, but the impression that you get when reading this statement is that it's almost as if it's really been laid out to be as simple as possible so that really you can't make any mistakes when you're recalling the events which happened. What we need to remember is that we're not talking about someone trying to recall events which happened a year, 5 or 10 years after the event. He was asked to recall these events just months after the triple murder occurred. Yet so far he's not entirely sure what car he was driving. He doesn't know what he purchased from the motorbike shop. He has no idea what the conversation was in the car. And really, this is just a start of the actual statement itself. Let's continue from where we left off. At that time, I didn't know where we were going. Mick said Jack would show me where a deal was going to be. He said, did I know this place? And I said, I'm not sure. He said, don't worry, Jack would show you where to go. Nothing happened on the journey, just normal chat. He told me I was going to swap cars, and I was going to get in the car with Jack, and he was going to meet Pat on his own. We stopped in a lay-by near the Halfway House, which is a pub restaurant on the A127. When we stopped in the lay-by, I got in the car with Jack. Mick was going to the Halfway House with Jack. We got as far as the end of the lay-by gates, and we swapped drivers. Jack was to swap number plates. I got my feet wet. Jack was wearing overalls and wellies. I remember the wellies more than the overalls because they were new. When we stopped, Jack got out to stick the new number plates over the existing plates, but they wouldn't stick as it was too wet. I saw the number plates he was trying to stick, and they were B registration as well, and they were also brand new. When the plates couldn't be stuck, they were put in the back of the car. He then said to drive down to the halfway house pub. I'd been to the pub only as a child or driving past on the way to Southend. Now, during this section of the statement, we have the added detail being put in to the story. Now, in my opinion, and it is my own personal opinion, I'm not trying to persuade anyone here, but I believe that these little pieces of detail are added in order to add credibility to the version of events being told by Darren Nichols. If you are reading this or if you are hearing this in court, the added details such as I got my feet wet, the number plates wouldn't stick because they were too wet, I've been past this pub as a child or on my way to Southend, these little additional details which don't actually add anything to the actual story, but they do give a sense of credibility to what he is actually saying. And as I said, this is my own personal opinion, I'm not trying to persuade anyone here, but I believe that these details are actually added on purpose in order to create the illusion that the events which Darren Nichols is describing are actually completely factual. Now, I'm not saying that Darren Nichols is lying wholeheartedly here, but I certainly believe that the way he actually mentions and talks about the events of December the 6th cannot, in my personal opinion, be truthful. When we got to the pub, Jack told me to park at the back as far away from the A127 as possible, which I did. I could see Mick's Toyota parked in front of us to the left. After we parked, Jack changed his mind and said, no, don't park here, park closer to the A127. So I moved the car. I could still see the Hilux, which was in front again but to my right. Then we had to leave the car running because the windows were misting up because of the weather. I said, shall we have a drink? And Jack said no. Then he said we were waiting for Pat to arrive and then we were going to go to a meeting point. Shortly after this time, he said, right, go. Okay, now, this section again, the adding in of the windows being misted up because of the weather outside, we had to put the heaters on. I could still see the vehicle to my right, then to my left. Personally, I believe, especially when it comes to the demisting of the windows, the little details are added here, in my personal opinion, just to add credibility to Darren Nichols' version of events. Let's continue with the statement. I saw a dark coloured Range Rover when he said that. The Range Rover drove and parked next to Mickey's Hilux. I couldn't see who was in the Range Rover. Jack then told me to drive off up the slip road by the pub and back down the A127 to Southend. So that is what I did. Then he gave me directions down the A127 and onto the A130 to Chelmsford, I think, which I'm familiar with. The A130 goes from the A127 all the way to Chelmsford, but we went to the Rettendon Turnpike, which is a roundabout with traffic lights on it. I went straight over to carry on towards Chelmsford on the other side of Rettendon Turnpike and up the hill and then back down the hill and out the other side. Jack then said slow down and take the next right, which I did. It was a lane, not a road. Then I turned left into a gap to turn the car around. The headlamps were facing the road back towards the A130. Jack told me he'd ring me when he wanted me to pick him up. I had my mobile phone with me. He got out and had a bag and a coat from the back. The bag, I think, was a canvas, sausage-shaped bag. I didn't notice it in the car before. I might have done, but it didn't register. He told me he would ring me when he wanted me to pick him up. So I pulled off and went right towards Chelmsford. Important point to remember here is that nowhere in any eyewitness accounts or eyewitness statements is there mention of a Passat pulling into that lane. There's no mention of headlights being seen down that lane pointing back towards Main Road, or any visible eyewitness account of a Passat turning in or out of Workhouse Lane. Let's now continue. I drove down the road to the first point I could turn around to a petrol station. Then I drove back up the road and parked in a pub on the left-hand side of the road. I left the engine running and checked my phone to see I had a lousy signal, so I moved to get a better signal up the road. The pub I was in had a bright pink Morris Minor. The next pub I parked in past the lane and up the hill and took the first left turn. I went up that road, turned around, first left up there, then came up and parked outside the first house on my left and waited for him to ring. I didn't wait there very long. My phone rang. Jack said come and pick us up, and I hung up. I think I might have said okay. I turned right, went back down the road and had to wait for a few cars to go past so I could turn right into the lane. Then I turned the car round to face the road again. I didn't see anyone, and after a short period of time the back opened up and Jack got in. I didn't notice the interior light come on. Okay, so he mentions here that he's had to hold up traffic in order to cut across and go back down the lane, yet no eyewitness reports have come, no one actually came forward to say, yeah, I stopped to let a Passat go down the lane. Especially, just imagine the next morning when you wake up, you were driving home from work, you were driving along that road, you saw someone entering that lane. It's not a normal, residential turn-in. It's a turning down a little small farm track. You're going to remember seeing a vehicle turn down that track around that sort of time. You have to remember that this crime, this murder, was incredibly big news, especially in the local area. And people that were passing would have seen this Passat holding up the traffic, cutting across the other line of traffic and heading down the lane, because the next morning on the news and everywhere else in the newspapers, 3 men have been shot dead with a shotgun in a Range Rover. Oh yeah, Christ, I saw a vehicle turning down there last night. Not one person came forward to say, I saw a Passat that evening, I was held up by a Passat. No one, not a single person, which I find incredibly strange. Anyway, let's now continue. I then said, where's Mick? He said he won't be a minute, he's dropped something. Jack was sitting between the back seats talking to me. Then Mick opened the passenger door of the car and the interior light came on. When the light came on, I was looking at Jack. I noticed he had surgical gloves on and I saw something on him like blood. Mick said, turn the interior light off. Mick had shut the door around the same time. Then he said, let's get going. He said, go left towards the Rettendon Turnpike, so I pulled out. Something clicked in my mind that something had happened. I pulled out in front of a car. Mick asked if I was okay. I said yes I was, and then we just drove up towards the Rettendon Turnpike. Mick said they won't fuck with us no more. And Jack said yeah, it was quite funny because when Mick had shot one of them, the gun fell apart. He kept asking me if I was okay several times. I realised what had happened, but not to who. So I said, I hope I don't fall out with you two. Mick said, no, you won't fall out with us. Mick started to hand over to Jack parts of the gun. I saw the barrels. I don't know the names of the other parts, but I definitely saw the barrels. I was driving, I was a bit confused at the time. From the Rettendon Turnpike, we went back down the A130 to Southend. Then at the roar of traffic lights, I turned left. Straight to the bottom of that road, we turned right, and then took another right turn on or 2 roads later. Now this is another part of Darren Nichols' version of events which interests me greatly, and that is because he goes into a great detail regarding the route he actually took after exiting the lane. I went down the road, I took the first left, I went over the traffic lights, went round the roundabout 4 times, took the third exit, took a right, took a left, went down that hill, over the traffic lights, round another roundabout. He's almost giving you the impression that he has complete clarity of mind at this point, but it's worth remembering that only 30 seconds earlier he was in a complete trance and he pulled out in front of another motorist. He didn't really know what was going on, he didn't know what to say. As he put it in the book Blogs 19, he was in a zombie sort of trance-like state. Yet 30 seconds later he's able to tell you exactly what route he took, the roads that he took, the turns that he took, where he went over the roundabout. He's able to give you a great deal of information. What I'm trying to say is, at this point in time, it appears that he has complete clarity of mind and is able to recall all of these turns that he took. Yet if we just go back to the beginning of the statement, he couldn't remember what happened during conversations with Steele and Jack. He was quite vague during that part of his statement. But after the event, and after even admittedly saying he was in a trance-like confused state, 30 seconds after that point, he is able to completely give you a really sort of clear idea of exactly where he turned, where he went, and basically exactly what happened 30 seconds after being in a complete daze. That is what I find a little bit odd. Let's now continue. As we went up the road, there was a pub on the right, the Hungry Horse or Hungry Hippo, something like that. I drove into the car park of the pub and parked next to Mick's Toyota, which was on the left, and stopped the car. They got out and I was still sitting there. Mick had opened up his Toyota. He told me to go and get in the Toyota, which I did. Then they were getting changed sort of thing. Mick was taking off his wellies and overalls off over his wellies, then slipping his shoes on. Boiler suit and wellies were put in the pickup truck, and Jack did the same. Then we drove off. Mick drove the Hilux with me in the passenger seat, and Jack was behind us in the Passat. We drove past the Rettendon lane. Then Jack overtook us on the dual carriageway as we were driving slower. There was some conversation in the car with Mr. Steele. He said Jack was a very cold-hearted person. I said, why? He said, first of all, they'd stopped down the lane and the gate had been shut. So I got out of the Range Rover and I didn't know where Jack was. Then Jack leant into the Range Rover and shot all three of them. Jack handed Mick a gun and Mick shot them. Then he said once that had happened, Jack reloaded his gun and shot them all in the back of the head. I can't recall anything else that was said. I did say, can we stop and have a drink? Mick originally said yes, good idea, as Mick looked shaken up. But when we got to Mark's Tate, he said we'd best get home straight away. Then I got in my car and headed back to Braintree. Now, as many of you will be aware, ballistic testing was done, and in the eyes of the ballistic experts, only one gun fired the shots which killed Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. Interestingly, Darren Nichols' version of events mentions two guns, and one gun actually firing shots against these victims, or into these victims I should say, before the gun breaks. And that is important because it shows the usage of two firearms and not one, which we know is incorrect. I don't believe that one gun fell apart and someone was fumbling around for the bits in the pitch black. I simply believe that this was added another piece of detail, or another sort of visual piece of detail, in order to really add a little bit more credibility to Darren Nichols' version of events. So what is the purpose of today's video, and what is it that I'm exactly trying to say here? I personally believe that there's a possibility, however small that possibility may be, that Darren Nichols is actually reciting someone else's involvement in this crime. Is it a pure coincidence that Darren Nichols mentions pulling out in front of an unsuspecting motorist from a small farm track, and a member of the public comes forward and actually really describes the same thing but in a different vehicle? It wasn't a Volkswagen Passat which pulled out onto Main Road, but a Ford Escort van. We also have the type of weapon which was used. I mean, you may be saying to yourself, but how could Darren Nichols know all of this information? He was just a driver. He didn't have any involvement with anyone else. He was just with Mick and Jack. They did the crime. That's how he knew all the details. The problem is some of the details he gives us are incorrect. Why would Mick and Jack mention a gun falling apart, which couldn't have possibly fallen apart after it fired shots, because there was only one gun used in the crime? How can we explain the fact he didn't know what car he was driving when he was the unsuspecting getaway driver in a triple murder? Some parts of Darren Nichols' statement appear quite believable and quite truthful in places, but you could also perceive it as information which he has either been fed or stories which he had been told regarding how this crime was committed. But where would he have got that information from? That's probably what you're asking yourself. It's important to remember that Darren Nichols was involved with not one, but two corrupt officers. And it's certainly not beyond the realms of possibility that these two corrupt officers knew details of that crime which weren't publicly released, such as phone records, such as witness statements of people coming forward at a later date, describing what they had seen, what they had heard. Just imagine if that information, that supposedly sensitive private information, had got back to those two corrupt officers. It's quite possible that Darren Nichols may have picked up or been fed some of that information. How do we explain that not one eyewitness account come forward and said that they saw a VW Passat turning into or exiting Workhouse Lane? How do we explain the lack of VW Passat tyre tracks entering or exiting the lane? Darren Nichols had the means and the contacts in order to have information which wasn't publicly available. Like it or not, he had dealings with corrupt officers. That is purely and simply a fact. I cannot prove that he had inside information regarding how this crime was committed, but you also cannot completely deny the possibility that he may have got information from one of these two officers. And at the start of this video, I mentioned a photograph which I wanted to show you. And this is a photograph which actually appeared recently in a newspaper article regarding Jack Wome's imminent release from prison. It shows an Essex Police incident control vehicle at the scene of the crime, alongside no other than a Ford Escort van with its registration plate blacked out. Was this vehicle used by the police in some way, or was this actually owned by the occupiers of Workhouse Farm? I'd certainly lean more towards it being involved with the police due to the fact that the registration plate has been purposely hidden. Hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. There should be some videos in front of you now from the channel. Do feel free to check those out. And also the Essex Boys playlist, which has all of the videos regarding this case in one convenient folder. So do feel free to work your way through those. Hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. I look forward to seeing you again in the next one. Take care. Cheers.